welcome to the podcast's 40th episode. If you've been enjoying this series so far, you've probably listened as I've explored the subject and study of ecology on multiple levels. The first episode introduced ecology as a scientific field, as a discipline, and the second episode began the examination of the different levels of ecology, starting with the behavioral ecology of the individual organism. The third episode increased the scale to examine groups of individuals or populations and how they interact with other populations and with the world around them. Today I'm going to increase the scale once again and examine biological communities. Where a population is a group of individuals of the same species, a community is composed of multiple populations of different species, all interacting and coexisting in the same region or given area. Communities are composed of different species, and they're defined and characterized by the ways that those species interact with each other. The natural world is kind of like a free-for-all game of eating, mating, and dying. The natural imperative of a species, from an evolutionary perspective, is to adapt and evolve to maximize its fitness in its native environment. The fitness of an organism implies its capacity to keep itself healthy enough and safe enough to be able to reproduce and create another viable generation so that they can perpetuate the species. Fitness is basically the individual organism's capacity to perpetuate itself. In order to maintain their fitness, to survive and reproduce, the organism must engage in some kind of behaviors. They need to eat and consume nutrients. They need to find a mate and reproduce. And they need to do all of this in such a way so as to avoid death by predation or disease. It's a rather tall order when you're playing in the free-for-all Super Bowl of death that is the natural world. All of these behaviors involve interactions with other organisms, with other species. For example, all predators eat some manner of prey animal, just as all herbivorous animals eat plants. And then you have the numerous bacteria, parasites, microbes, and assorted microorganisms that live on or in larger animals. These behaviors create complex species interactions that can become anything from an evolutionary codependence to dangerous competition. These species interactions typically have some sort of influence over the fitness of the involved species. A neat example are pitcher flowers, or other flowers with deep basins. They've evolved such a depth to keep out the birds and the insects from taking their nectar, and maybe damaging their sensitive reproductive organs. But there are some species of small, fluid-feeding birds that have also evolved longer snouts and longer proboscis organs to extract nectar from deep within those flowers. Another example is the evolutionary arms race that happens between parasites or pathogens and their hosts. When the host evolves a defense, the pathogen evolves a way around it. The host endures the parasite for some time until it evolves another novel defense. The pathogen evolves another mechanism for infection, and back and forth over millions and millions of years. Species interactions can be categorized based on how they impact the fitness of the species involved. Interactions can be mutualist, competitive, commensal, or they can involve the outright consumption and digestion of another species. I like to think of this as a spectrum, like a spectrum of fitness outcomes from specific behaviors and interactions, with the spectrum having mutual fitness gains on one end and mutual fitness penalties on the other. A mutualist interaction between two species sees both of them enjoying a fitness benefit. Everyone wins in a mutualist relationship. The cover image for this episode, and for this whole series on ecology, depicts a bee enjoying some nectar from a flower, while the flower coats the bee in pollen, which gets deposited at every other flower that the bee goes on to visit. This is a mutualist relationship, because both the bee and the flower benefit. They both gain. They both enjoy a fitness bonus. The bee will get food in the form of nectar, and this helps keep it alive. It keeps it healthy and strong enough so it can care for the bee larva, or support the hive in other ways. The flower gets the bee to act like a commercial jetliner for its pollen. The pollen coats the bee's hair and its legs, and as the bee flies from one flower to the next, little bits of this pollen will get shaken off or brushed off, and they'll fall down into the new flower and they'll pollinate it, and the flowers reproduce. This behavioral pattern has been so beneficial and influential on their fitness that it's been ingrained evolutionarily in the flower's reproductive cycle. They use bees as a vector, like a big flying bus for their pollen. Other mutualist interactions include the cleaner shrimp that eat food out from the teeth of larger fish, where one animal gets food and the other animal gets a nice cleaning. Or the microbes that live inside your gut and help you digest food, where the microbe gets nutrients and the products of its digestion allow you to absorb more nutrients. Or the fungus that penetrate the roots of plants and expand their absorptive capacity, where the fungus allows the plant to get harder to metabolize nitrogenous compounds. But it's important to understand that species don't interact in a mutualist manner just because they're being nice. They aren't necessarily being altruistic. Sometimes a mutualist relationship is just the easiest way for an organism to get what it needs, because a mutualist relationship typically requires a low energy investment for a relatively decent fitness reward. Because of this, it's possible for one species to cheat, in a manner of speaking, by deceiving or exploiting the other species. Flowers will do this to bees from time to time, because the flowering plant will sometimes produce like a dud flower. It'll be a flower structure that doesn't have any nectar. It has pollen, but it has no nectar. And so the bee is attracted to the flower, and the flower gets to cover the bee in its pollen, but the plant doesn't spend any nutrients or energy producing nectar. And so when the bee gets there, there's no nectar for it. There's no food for it. So the flower benefits because he's still using the bee as this transmission vector, but the bee gets nothing. And this takes me to the next category of interaction, down the spectrum a little bit from mutualism. This kind of interaction is called a commensalism, and it occurs when one species benefits, but the other species receives nothing. No benefit and no penalty. In most cases, commensalism occurs when an organism benefits in some way from the secondary effects of another organism's behavior. So let's say that an animal like a bear eats a steady diet of blueberries, and it has pretty consistent bowel movements. And let's also say that there's an insect that will dig through the bear's waste, through its poop, to find edible remains of the bear's original meal, of its blueberries, or of its salmon, say if the bear ate salmon. In this interaction, the insect is getting food, so it benefits. But the larger animal, the bear, experiences no gains or benefits. Digging through the bear's poop doesn't affect it at all. It's not using its waste, it doesn't care about it, so if the insect digs through it, the bear isn't affected. No gain, no penalty. Another example of commensalism, one that's a little less nasty, is that of the ant birds and the ants that they follow through the jungle. The ants will march in a large column. They hunt in a big group because ants, they win combat through numbers. They just overwhelm their opponents and swarm over them with hundreds and hundreds of ants, and the sheer weight, the sheer quantity of them all overwhelms whatever they're trying to kill and eat. And so, as the ants stomp around the jungle in this big armored column, they disturb the nests and hiding places of their prey. Sometimes their prey insects will hear them coming, or they'll smell them coming, and so the insects just book it out of there. They're like, I'm not hanging around for this armored column of ants to come smash down my door and eat me. I'm just going to run away. All of these disturbed prey insects that flee from the ants, they find themselves running right into the beaks of the ant birds, the tropical bird that feeds on these insects. So the ants don't really suffer. Even though the ants eat these insects, they don't suffer because those particular insects would have gotten away from them anyway. You know, an ant column is this kind of slow, lumbering super colony structure. And if you can just run away from that to the point where only like one or two ants might be able to keep up with you, those one or two ants aren't a threat. You're not being attacked by the main ant column, so you're pretty much out of the danger zone. So the ants don't suffer a penalty from their food running away. But the ant birds, the birds that follow the ants, they do benefit because they actually hang around and clean up these insects as they're running away. So the bird benefits, it gets food, but the ants don't really suffer a penalty because they weren't going to get those insects anyway. If we go further down the spectrum of fitness outcomes, we come to the next strategy, which is just outright consumption. A consumption interaction involves a clear benefit to one species and a clear penalty to another, like when any predator captures and kills prey. or when any herbivore eats a plant, or when any parasite feeds off of its host. In each case, the consumer benefits because it gets food, while the consumed suffers because it gets consumed. It gets chewed up. It most likely gets killed. The wolf gets food when it eats the moose. The giraffe gets food when it eats leaves from the tree. And the tapeworm gets food when it infects and feeds off of its host. But the moose suffers because it's getting eaten and presumably killed. The tree suffers because its branches get ripped up and its leaves get destroyed. The host of the tapeworm suffers because it doesn't get all the nutrients that it should be getting from its food. Nature provides a hugely strong evolutionary pressure to avoid getting eaten. To this end, species have evolved a hugely varied library of defenses and protection mechanisms. Camouflage can be evolved by prey to avoid detection by predators, or it can be adopted by predators to help them sneak up on prey. This camouflage typically involves the animal adopting the color of its ambient surroundings. Just how like an African lion kind of has that golden yellow color similar to the grasses of the Serengeti. A snowshoe hare has a white winter coat that helps it blend in with the snow, hiding it from hawks and foxes and stuff. But in the summer, it develops a brown or a gray coat, and this can better hide it in the underbrush and the dry vegetation. But camouflage isn't just limited to color. It can also involve shape and texture. There are species of insects that look remarkably similar to leaves or to twigs, and their survival strategy depends on them being able to pass as just part of the plant. If you have a predator that eats insects, it's not going to eat a plant, so it'll ignore anything that looks like a leaf or a twig. The insects that can fool predators by looking like a plant or a twig or whatever will live another day to eat and reproduce. Other times, an animal may join a herd or a school or a flock, which gives it protection through numbers. Fish will often swim in a school with many other fish because their numerous bodies and their scales can confuse and disorient predators as they're swimming around. The light will kind of reflect off of them and they make this complex glittering shape. It's really hard for like a shark or an eel or whatever kind of predator to pick out a single individual and go after them. In much the same way, zebras have evolved their characteristic black and white vertical stripes, because when zebras are roaming in a herd, these stripes make them all blend together, and so predators have a really difficult time identifying an individual zebra. When a lion can't pick out an individual zebra, when it can't figure out where one particular individual is so he can track him down and chase him and pounce on him, it makes it really difficult for the lion to kind of figure out how to approach the zebra herd, how to hunt them and get food. And it protects the zebras, because while the lion is confused and trying to figure all this out, the zebras are just hanging out. They're eating or drinking, they're generally safe. And if the lion can get its shit together to attack the zebras, by that point the zebras have probably been tipped off by scent or sight to the lion's presence, and they have a greater chance of escaping early. You can start to see these evolutionary pressures shaping the survivability and the fitness of species in the face of other biotic pressures. But in most cases, a herd simply offers greater numbers of disposable bodies. If a predator were to attack, the herd would respond by running away. The fastest individuals in the herd would inevitably end up getting away, while the weakest and the sickest end up being the slowest, and so they kind of lag behind, and they get attacked and killed by the predator. If you're a healthy bison or water buffalo or some kind of cattle, it benefits you to hang out in a herd as opposed to hanging out by yourself. This is because if you run into a predator by yourself, that predator has its eye on you. It's definitely going to try and attack you, and it's probably going to kill and eat you. But if you're in a herd, there's a number of weaker individuals, like the sick, the young, and the old, and all of these individuals will linger behind to get killed by the predator, which will give you, a healthy adult, a good chance to escape and live another day. In many cases, an animal may evolve a defensive structure, like armor plating, tough scales, or a thick hide. These structures offer passive mechanical protection from predatory attacks, like the talons of a hawk, or the claws of a hyena, or whatever. But these scales and armor plating, it's passive protection. They just kind of sit there, and if you get hit, okay, well, they'll defend you against that, but they're not going to stop you from getting hit in the first place. Some species have more active defenses, like long sharp spines, thorns, or quills. This discourages predators or other animals from physically messing with you, because if you have these spines or these quills, you can kind of poke the predator, and the predator doesn't want to get hurt. He doesn't want to get these quills in his paws, or he doesn't want to have a thorn scrape his mouth, or a claw or a spine hit his eye. The predator has to watch out for his own body too. And so if the prey animal has these active defenses, the predator kind of thinks twice before he goes and attacks him. The electric eel has one of these kind of more unique defensive capabilities, where it's evolved to emit a rapid electrical pulse that can hurt and scare away predators. Sometimes a plant or an animal may evolve some kind of chemical defense, like a poison, to deter those animals that would eat them. This is most often the case in tropical amphibians, like tree frogs, which are usually colored with some vibrant pattern. Tree frogs can be neon green, or a bright blood red, or a fiery orange that drips away to a deep blue. All of these weirdly bright and colorful hues, they send a message to any predators nearby that these frogs are full of nasty chemicals like toxins and poisons, and if you eat them, you're in for a bad time. If the predator eats the frog, it'll get really sick and possibly die from it. So predators will quickly learn to avoid eating things with these crazy bright colors. Various plants can also express chemicals that make their leaves taste bitter, and this will discourage a grazing herbivore from destroying their leaf tissue. Imagine you're like a giraffe or something and you're out in the wild, and you start chewing on a tree. And at first, the leaves are pretty good, they're nice and succulent leaves, and you're just enjoying a nice salad. But the tree responds to this. The tree senses the mechanical damage. It senses you chewing and destroying its leaves, and so it releases a chemical in all of its other leaves that makes the leaves taste bitter. And so after your first couple minutes of chewing, you move on to some more leaves, you start to realize that they taste gross. They're not very satisfying. It leaves like maybe a chalky residue or a nasty taste in your mouth. And it's unpalatable. As a giraffe, you don't want to eat from this tree anymore. It's gross. So you move on. This is a kind of chemical defense that plants have evolved to kind of shoo away herbivores like grazing cattle or giraffes or insects or whatever might eat their plant tissue. The most simple defense is just running away. A prey animal might evolve some kind of escape behavior, like a sudden leap backward, a rapid sprint, or they might play dead. Some escape behaviors are more complicated than just running away. Like you might have an octopus that will squirt a cloud of ink and then swim away, and the cloud of ink kind of scares and disorients its potential predator, as well as visually blocking off the octopus so it can make a clean escape with the predator not really knowing where he's going for a moment. There's also skunks that have glands in their rectums that'll expel a noxious gas. And whenever a potential predator smells that gas, it's really gross, and the predator will just try and run away. It won't try and mess with the skunk anymore because it doesn't want to get covered in that really awful odor. You also have like an insect that will spray a predator with a blast of acidic abdominal juice. In their abdomens, they might have some little closed-off organs or chemical compartments, and when they sense a predator, they'll bend their abdomen forward, they'll mix these chemicals together, and they'll violently erupt in this caustic ejection. And if it lands on the animal, on the predator, it can burn them and cause serious pain. If it gets in their eyes, it might blind them. So predators learn pretty quickly that if an animal has one of these defenses, like a chemical toxin that it spews at you or a poison in its blood that if you eat makes you sick, predators learn to avoid these things. And the animals that have these defenses, they benefit because they're not getting eaten by predators anymore, or at least not as much. And their survivability, their fitness increases. They're more likely to reproduce and have viable, healthy offspring. There are other, more subtle ways for a species to avoid becoming lunch, like mimicry. When one species evolves a trait that keeps away predators, like a noxious gas or a poison compound, another species can benefit by evolving a morphological similarity to that first species. Mimicry was first described in butterflies and moths, and then again in a wider variety of insects. It tends to occur much less often in mammals, reptiles, and other large animals, where this kind of full-body morphological evolution just isn't really feasible. For example, think of a butterfly that expels a nasty odor, or has some internal chemical that makes it taste bitter and disgusting. Because of these defensive adaptations, predators will learn to identify that butterfly based on stuff like its wing pattern, its wing coloration, and they'll avoid them. So if a butterfly looks like one of those butterflies that has a chemical defense, predators won't eat it. This creates a fitness benefit just for looking like that particular species, and so this is where mimicry comes in. Other species of butterfly can adapt to have a similar appearance, a similar morphology, and even though they don't have the chemical defenses themselves, the predators don't know that, and they'll still avoid them. So there's two kinds of mimicry: Batesian mimicry and Mullerian mimicry, which are defined based on the number of evolutionary participants. In Batesian mimicry, one species develops adaptations to make it look like another species. The species it's mimicking is just doing its own thing, just minding its own business. They're not in a co-evolutionary relationship. That's the case for Mullerian mimicry, which involves two species that are in a cooperative co-evolutionary relationship. These two species evolve to share similarities so that they can both mutually enjoy the benefits of repelling as many predators as possible. Alright, so I've talked about mutualism at one end of the spectrum, where both parties benefit, and then I talked about commensalism, where one party benefits and the other party doesn't, but it doesn't suffer either, and then I went over consumption, where one species benefits and another species, typically the one getting eaten, definitely suffers a penalty. It definitely suffers. And now I've come to the other end of the spectrum of interactions, where species interact not for mutual gain, but instead they compete with each other for limited resources, and they both suffer because of it. Competition between species causes them both to struggle, to endure penalties to their fitness as they fight for the food or the living space or whatever resource it is that they share. This kind of interspecific competition occurs not just between species, but between members of the same species in what's known as intraspecific competition. The basis for all of this competition in every circumstance is that the participating parties both use the same limited resource. There's only so much resource to go around, and because both parties need it, both species or both individuals in the case of intraspecific competition, they have to compete over it, and competing is hard on both of them. If you've been listening to my podcast for a while now, you've probably heard me mention an ecological niche, or the role that a species plays in its native habitat, in its ecosystem. This niche is defined by what resources the organism uses, and what resources it produces. Your typical tree, whether it be an oak tree, a birch, or some kind of tropical tree, all trees have an expansive niche. They're autotrophs, which means they're primary producers that absorb light energy directly from the sun and turn it into chemical energy. They don't feed on a prey species. A tree also has a trunk and a canopy, and these physical structures form a dynamic biological habitat for other species to live in, like tree lizards, primates, and birds. The tree produces leaves that other species can eat, or flowers that insects and hummingbirds can drink nectar from, or it produces fruits that other species can eat, or hollow out and live inside. So to tie this back in with competition, when two species both use the same food source, or live in the same kind of shelter, they're forced to compete with each other for those limited resources, for that limited food source, or that limited amount of shelter. There are two general kinds of niches. There's a more theoretical concept called the fundamental niche, which is basically the entire possible range of the species given the right climate conditions and available food sources. In contrast, there's the realized niche, which is some smaller segment within the fundamental niche that the species is actually known to occupy in real life. For example, consider a species of flying insect that eats the leaves of a particular plant. In this case, the fundamental niche of the insect is basically anywhere that the plant species is. Anywhere the insect can find its food, it can live. That's its fundamental niche. But in some areas, there's a species of caterpillar, and both the flying insect and the caterpillar eat the same leaves. They're in competition for the same food resource. For the sake of the example, let's say that the caterpillar is much better at eating the leaves. It can eat them faster, or it can digest a defensive toxin present in the plant tissue which the flying insect can't handle in high doses. For whatever reason, the caterpillar species is a better competitor, and the flying insect cannot maintain its presence in the regions with the caterpillar. It just gets outcompeted, it gets pushed out. And so in this case, the realized niche of the flying insect is the regions of the fundamental niche with no caterpillars. The caterpillars kind of push the flying insects out of their region, and so the realized niche of the flying insect is this smaller, kind of lumpier internal portion of the fundamental niche. This is a more abstract concept, so let me go over another example. Consider two species of birds that eat seeds. One species of bird is smaller, and it eats small and medium-sized seeds. The other species of bird is larger, and it eats seeds that are both large and medium-sized. So in this case, as you can tell, the niches of each bird species doesn't completely overlap. The smaller birds are the only ones that go after small seeds, and the larger birds are the only ones who go after larger seeds. And so the only area of overlap in their niche is manifest in the medium-sized seeds, which they both eat, and thus they both compete over. Because a competitive relationship is an unstable relationship, one that deals out only fitness penalties, the two competing species will evolve a more stable coevolutionary position. They'll evolve to coexist through a process called niche differentiation. In this case, the smaller birds will evolve to eat only the smaller seeds, while the larger birds will evolve only to eat the larger seeds. In this way, each species still maintains a food source, but now they aren't competing for anything. However, this doesn't mean members of the same species aren't still competing against each other. Because both species have started to avoid intermediate seeds, each species population is now eating out of a smaller total pool of available food. So if you have the same number of individuals, but they've kind of restricted their diet to a smaller range of food stuff, you're going to have more intraspecific competition for that food, because there's more people going for less food. This will lead to a phenomenon called character displacement, where the morphology, physiology, and behavioral patterns of the two bird species will also evolve to settle into their distinct coexisting niches. In this example, the two bird species will experience character displacement as they evolve to adapt to a smaller size range of seeds that they're willing to eat. Perhaps the smaller birds get even smaller, and they evolve longer, more narrow beaks so as to better handle and manipulate the small seeds. The larger bird species might evolve a heavier beak so as to better break apart the larger seeds. In essence, competing for the medium-sized seeds induced an evolutionary pressure on each bird species so that they would prefer small or large seeds respectively, because they would prefer to avoid competition. This evolutionary pressure fuels character displacement, where each species adapts to its new, more limited diet. This is an example of a fitness trade-off. The smaller birds can better handle smaller seeds, but by becoming smaller and evolving a longer beak, they lose the ability to open even the medium-sized seeds. The larger birds can better break open the larger seeds, but this means they're less likely to survive a drought. If this large bird species lives in a forest, and the forest experiences a drought, then the native plants will produce fewer seeds, smaller seeds, and there'll be much less food available for the larger birds. A lot of ecological thinking is based on these kind of causal chains of reactions. Say you have a drought, okay, the drought affects the plants. The plants are affected, they can't produce seeds, and now all the animals that eat those seeds suffer. And so in this way, a drought hurts birds. It's kind of an indirect causal chain where you can see one thing, one cause will kind of ripple out and affect many other different things. These fitness trade-offs define a species, and they define its niche, and they define its role in the habitat and the ecosystem. In most cases, these fitness trade-offs and niches are shaped by species interactions that have been going on for thousands, if not millions of years. This kind of heavily reinforced evolutionary pattern creates very stable communities, where every behavior and quality of an organism is integrated into the chemical orchestra of the whole thing. When you understand the stability of an ecosystem shaped by natural selection for hundreds of thousands of years, you start to see why there's an inherent danger in invasive species. It's like throwing a big rock in a still pond, which makes a splash and roils up all the sand on the lake bed. The invasive species comes in and destabilizes the new ecosystem. This is because the behaviors and actions of the invasive species haven't had a chance to be tempered by the evolutionary responses of other species in the community. They haven't yet evolved niche differentiation, and so the invasive species comes in and can easily outcompete the native species and totally wrecks their fitness. They just throw everything into chaos. The invasive species might outcompete a native species at finding food or at avoiding predators. It might be more aggressive and violently seize the limiting resource, or openly attack its competitors. It might find a food source and eat so much of it that they deprive that food to every other species in the native habitat that depends on it. In this way, invasive species pose a serious threat to the short-term and long-term stability of community ecosystems. So far in the episode, I've limited my discussion to the nature of the various types of species interactions that help define a community. But these generalized types don't explain the full picture. You see, a community is composed of dozens, if not hundreds or even thousands of species, plants, animals, fungus, even bacteria, and all of these have some kind of relationship with all of the other species in their habitat, in their community, either directly or indirectly. All of these relationships form an ecological web that rivals the human brain in its complexity. To study the community as a whole, biologists have to ask questions about the community as a whole. They look at all the species that live in a given community habitat, at all of the intra- and interspecific interactions, at all of the mutualist, commensal, competitive, and consumption-based interactions, and all of the subsequent secondary and tertiary and quaternary effects of all of these interactions. One of the ways that biologists try to study communities as a whole is through a food web, or a hierarchical structure of predation, with an apex predator at the top, herbivores near the middle, and plants at the bottom, with detrivores and scavengers cleaning up all the dead stuff. Food webs are dependent on the habitat, on the species within it, and how they interact. Another way to study community ecology is by observing a process called succession. This is a part of ecology that I find really fascinating, because it demonstrates in real time how life is like a self-perpetuating tide, literally growing upon itself and compounding in complexity and raw size. Life begets life, not just through simple parent-offspring reproduction, but through the emergence and stabilization of increasingly complex ecosystems. This is called succession, the process through which ecosystems become more developed, denser, and capable of supporting larger and more diverse food webs. The first stage in the process is called primary succession. This occurs when some kind of life form moves into an area as the first layer of biological substrate. Perhaps we're talking about a dry plain, or a forest recently cleared by a forest fire, or a grassland wiped clean by a flood, or a region ground smooth by a glacier. In any case, the habitat begins as an uncolonized expanse of land, and primary succession begins when the first forms of life come in and begin to spread, be they plants, fungus, insects, or bacteria. For example, let's say that there's a dry field that's recently been disturbed by a forest fire. The forest fire has cleared out all of the previous vegetation, and it's forced out all of the animals. The first species to return to the habitat would be weeds and small shrubs, grasses, and other rapidly growing plants. Through their frenzied growth, these tiny plants create a tangled mat of roots in the upper layers of the soil, and this stabilizes it. This stabilizes the soil, and it protects it from getting washed away in the rain or from being blown away in the wind. This induced stability caused by the first stage of succession allows the second stage of succession to begin, and this is called an early successional community, which sees the increasing abundance of longer-lived plants, like shrubs and herbaceous plants and flowering plants and this kind of stuff. These longer-lived plants create a denser root mat, which penetrates deeper into the soil, and they also grow higher into the air, which creates a thicker layer of biological substrate across the field. Insects and rodents and other small creatures are attracted to the blooming growth of the vegetation in the second successional stage, and they come in because they can find food in the seeds and flowers, or shelter under the leaves and between the shoots. This is also where we start to see the effects of species interactions in full swing. Some species facilitate the presence of other species, like a plant that's required in the diet of some grazing mammal, or a fruit that's required for the life cycle of an insect. Other species could instead inhibit the presence of other species, kind of like a tall tree that would block out the light for a smaller, shorter plant. This increasing wave of complexity ushers in the third successional stage, which is called a mid-successional community. Here, the trend continues, and we see the emergence of plants with even longer lives, like large shrubs and small trees. The size of the ecosystem is growing almost exponentially, as the vertical space made available to various critters is greatly expanded. With the growth of trees, the community will start to see interactions with more and more species of birds, with more tree-dwelling mammals like squirrels, and with more species of insect and lizard that are adapted to live on the tree trunk, or up on its canopy, in this huge network of branches that the trees can provide. Furthermore, larger mammals can also be supported in the community, as they can graze on the leaves of the trees. Larger mammals also means larger predators, which adds another layer of complexity to the community. The end stage of succession forms what's called a climax community. This community is defined by long-lived trees and other large plants, large animals, both prey and predator, and a huge variety of smaller mammals, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and insects that all climb and crawl throughout the undergrowth, through the canopy of the trees, and just kind of provide a background biological substrate for all of the more complex, larger things to grow off of and feed themselves off of. Climax communities are stable. They won't progress to any higher or more complex stage because they've pretty much maximized their biological output. Nutrients are being used as readily as they're available, and all the available space is taken up. The food webs are all set up and running efficiently, and species interactions are stable. The community has quite literally reached a climax in its complexity and stability. This stability will persist until the next forest fire, or the next flood, or the next glacier, or the next volcano, or whatever, comes by and destroys everything, and creates once more a barren field of disturbed soil. From this destroyed ruin, the process begins again. Weeds will come in and stabilize the soil. Larger shrubs and ferns and whatnot begin to appear, followed by smaller trees, then larger trees, and with them an associated increase in the size and abundance of animals dwelling within this matrix of vegetation. All of these processes are predictable based on species interactions. The physical and chemical interactions of plant and animal species create these successional trends. They create this pattern of increasing complexity, coming to a head with the climax community. The total extent of the climax community is limited by abiotic factors that work on a global scale. For example, the planet receives differing amounts of light energy and heat from the sun based on latitude, and this difference in the available energy is reflected in the species richness, the species density, the diversity of the region. Equatorial regions tend to have high heat, stable climates, and high humidity, which are all factors that heavily promote plant growth, and they enable the existence of huge, dense climax communities in the form of tropical rainforests. At higher latitudes, there's less light, and a corresponding drop in the number and abundance of available species. I'll talk about all of these trends and more in the next episode on global ecology. But as for community ecology, that's about all that I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you learned something cool, or that you heard something fascinating that got you to think more about the natural world around you. Perhaps this episode changed your perspective on something, or opened your mind to some of the ways that the biological world works. Whatever the case, I hope you enjoyed this episode and this playlist on ecology in general. And as always, thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.